when your silence disrupts the emotional pattern she took for granted. Something subtle but powerful begins to unfold inside her mind. At first, she may not even recognize it as absence. It feels more like a disruption, a missing rhythm in the way things used to be. She was accustomed to your reactions, your explanations, your availability, whether it was reassurance, attention, or even predictable disagreement. Your presence formed an emotional pattern she unconsciously relied on. When that pattern suddenly stops, her mind can no longer move on autopilot. Silence creates a pause, and in that pause, awareness begins. She notices that the usual emotional feedback loop is gone. There is no message to analyze, no reaction to interpret, no effort to measure. This absence forces her mind to slow down, and when it slows down, reflection replaces comfort. What once felt normal now feels incomplete. She begins to wonder why your silence feels heavier than your words ever did. The truth is that your reactions once gave her certainty. Certainty that she still mattered, certainty that she had influence, certainty that she was still central to your emotional world. Without those signals, the certainty dissolves and uncertainty takes its place. Her mind starts filling the gaps. Silence is never empty, it invites interpretation. She begins asking questions she never needed to ask before. Why isn't he reacting? Why isn't he explaining himself? Why isn't he trying to fix this? These questions pull her attention back to you, not because you are chasing her, but because you are no longer predictable. The emotional pattern she relied on has been interrupted, and the mind instinctively seeks to restore what feels familiar. In that process, you re-enter her thoughts, not as someone available, but as someone absent and unresolved. What makes this so powerful is that silence removes emotional leverage. When you were present and responsive, she could place you within a mental category she understood. You were reliable, accessible, and emotionally engaged. Now, without that feedback, you no longer fit neatly into her expectations. Your silence introduces mystery, and mystery commands attention. It forces her to reassess her assumptions about you, about the dynamic you shared, and about her own role in it. She begins to realize that your reactions were never obligations, they were choices. And now that you have chosen restraint, the meaning of your past presence becomes clearer. This disruption also exposes emotional dependency she may not have been aware of. She didn't necessarily need constant communication, but she needed the reassurance that it was available. When that reassurance disappears, the emotional safety she felt begins to weaken. She starts noticing the quiet moments where she would normally reach for your presence, even mentally, and finds nothing there. That absence doesn't just create longing, it creates introspection. She begins revisiting memories, conversations, and moments she once overlooked, trying to understand what changed and why it affects her so deeply. Your silence also shifts the balance of emotional energy. Instead of you investing attention and effort, the emotional weight now rests with her. She is the one thinking, wondering, replaying. And because human nature seeks resolution, her mind returns to the source of the disruption, you. Not because you demanded attention, but because you removed it. This is the paradox of silence. It speaks louder than pursuit because it forces the other person to engage internally rather than react externally. Over time, this disruption becomes a mirror. She starts to see how much of the emotional rhythm was sustained by your consistency, your patience, and your willingness to engage. Without it, she feels the imbalance, and that realization often arrives with clarity she didn't have before. Silence strips away distraction and reveals truth. It shows her that your presence was not background noise, but structure, not convenience, but value. And it is in this quiet disruption that her mind returns to you, not because you called for it, but because silence made your absence impossible to ignore. When she begins to feel the loss of the emotional security you quietly provided, the realization does not arrive with drama or clarity at first. It comes in small moments, subtle gaps in her emotional world that she cannot immediately explain. Emotional security is often invisible while it exists. It operates in the background, creating a sense of stability that feels natural and effortless. When you were present, your consistency, calmness, and emotional steadiness gave her a foundation she rarely questioned. She may not have acknowledged it openly, but your presence regulated the emotional environment around her. When that presence is removed, the absence becomes unmistakable, and the comfort she once relied on begins to fade. She starts to notice that situations which once felt manageable now feel heavier. Moments that used to pass easily now trigger uncertainty. Without your steady influence, her emotional baseline shifts. She may find herself more reactive, more restless, or more reflective, sensing that something important is missing but struggling to articulate what it is. This is the moment when emotional security reveals its true value, not through words, but through its absence. She begins to realize that the calm she once felt was not accidental. It was something you brought into her life through your composure, your reliability, and your quiet strength. As this awareness deepens, she begins comparing her current emotional state to how she felt when you were around. She recalls how your presence softened stressful moments, how your consistency reduced uncertainty, and how your emotional maturity provided balance when things felt chaotic. These reflections are not romantic fantasies, they are grounded recognitions of how stability works. Emotional security does not announce itself, it simply allows life to feel more manageable. When it disappears, the mind instinctively searches for its source, and her thoughts drift back to you. What unsettles her most is the realization that this security cannot be easily replaced. Attention from others may fill moments of distraction, but it does not recreate the grounded calm you offered. Surface level interaction lacks depth, and temporary validation fails to restore the sense of emotional safety she once felt. She begins to understand that what you provided was not excitement or constant reassurance, but something far more rare, emotional consistency. And consistency, once lost, leaves a void that cannot be filled by unpredictability or novelty. This recognition challenges her assumptions about strength and independence. She may have believed she did not rely on anyone emotionally or that her sense of stability came solely from within. Your absence forces her to confront the truth that emotional security is often co-created. It arises from trust, presence, and reliability, qualities you embodied without demanding recognition. She begins to see that your quiet strength created an environment where she felt safe to exist without overthinking. Without it, her emotional world feels less anchored, and that lack of grounding draws her attention back to you. The loss of emotional security also triggers reflection about the dynamic you share. She revisits moments where she may have undervalued your steadiness or mistaken your calm for indifference. She begins to see that emotional security does not come from intensity, drama, or constant validation, but from predictability and emotional maturity. These realizations shift her perspective, forcing her to reassess not only you, but her own emotional expectations and behavior. Over time, this awareness grows into appreciation, sometimes too late, sometimes quietly, but always honestly. She recognizes that the security you provided was not something she could demand or recreate at will. It was the result of your character, your discipline, and your emotional intelligence. And now that it is gone, its absence speaks louder than any argument or explanation ever could. And in realizing what she no longer feels, she finally understands the quiet stability you once gave and why her mind keeps returning to you. When she begins to sense that you are growing without her, it unsettles something deep within her that she cannot easily name. At first it feels like curiosity, then it becomes discomfort. Eventually it turns into reflection. She once believed, consciously or unconsciously, that she held a certain position in your life, that her presence mattered in ways that anchored you, that her attention shaped your direction, that her approval played a role in your momentum. When your growth continues without her, that assumption quietly collapses, and when assumptions collapse, The mind is forced to reassess everything it once believed. She starts noticing subtle signs. You seem calmer, more focused, less reactive. Your energy feels different, grounded, self-contained, no longer orbiting her moods or responses. Even if she doesn't see you directly, she senses it. Growth has a presence. It shows in restraint, in silence, in confidence that doesn't ask to be valid. Aided. This change challenges her sense of influence because it reveals a truth she may not have been prepared to face. You were never dependent on her to evolve. You were always capable of becoming more, and now you're doing it without seeking her acknowledgement. That realization strikes at the core of control. When she believed she was central to your emotional world, she felt secure, not necessarily because of dominance, but because of relevance. Relevance gives people comfort. It reassures them that they matter, that their presence shapes outcomes. When your growth continues without her involvement, that reassurance fades. She begins to wonder where she fits now, if she fits at all. The man she once thought she understood is no longer moving according to expectations she set in her mind, and that unpredictability draws her attention back to you. Her thoughts begin to shift from indifference to inquiry. She asks herself what changed, when it changed, and why she didn't see it coming. She may replay moments when you were present, trying to identify signs she overlooked, your discipline, your patience, your quiet ambition. She realizes that while she may have focused on surface dynamics, you were building something internal. And now that inner work is visible through your composure, your silence, and your refusal to seek validation. Growth, especially silent growth, has a way of demanding recognition without asking for it. This challenges her narrative. She may have told herself that you would stagnate without her, that distance would weaken you, or that absence would make you seek her approval even more. When reality contradicts that story, cognitive dissonance sets in. The mind resists being wrong, but it cannot ignore evidence, and the evidence is your evolution. You are not chasing, you are not reacting, you are not shrinking, you are becoming. And that forces her to reconsider how much control she ever truly had. What makes this moment powerful is that growth removes leverage. When you were emotionally responsive, your reactions gave her a sense of influence. Now, your restraint signals independence. Independence is attractive, not because it rejects connection, but because it cannot be controlled. She begins to understand that your strength was never tied to her presence, and that realization reshapes how she sees you. You are no longer familiar ground. You are unknown territory, and the unknown pulls attention far more strongly than the predictable ever could. As her sense of control weakens, her thoughts return to you, not out of nostalgia, but out of recalibration. She is trying to understand where she stands in a world where you no longer revolve around her. Your growth forces her to confront the possibility that she underestimated you, not in words, but in depth. And depth, once revealed, cannot be unseen. And it is when she realizes you are becoming more without her that her thoughts return, not to reclaim control, but to understand what she no longer has influence over. When her ego begins to question the narrative she once told herself about you, the shift is quiet but profound. At one point, she felt certain in her interpretation of who you were and what you represented in her life. She believed she understood your role, your intentions, and your limits. That narrative gave her comfort because it placed her in a position of certainty and control. She may have told herself that you would always be available, that your patience meant predictability, or that your silence meant weakness. But when your behavior changes, when you stop reacting, stop chasing, and stop reinforcing that story, her ego is forced into an uncomfortable confrontation with reality. Ego thrives on consistency. It depends on familiar pattern to maintain its sense of correctness. When those patterns disappear, ego does not immediately accept responsibility. Instead, it questions. She begins asking herself why things no longer align with what she believed. Why aren't you reaching out? Why aren't you responding the way you used to? Why does your absence feel intentional rather than accidental? These questions slowly dismantle the narrative she relied on. The man she thought she had figured out is no longer behaving according to expectation, and that disruption unsettles her sense of certainty. As her ego wrestles with this contradiction, she revisits past assumptions. She replays moments where she labeled your patience as passivity, your calmness as lack of ambition, or your consistency as dependence. In hindsight, those interpretations no longer hold up. Your silence forces her to consider the possibility that she misread your strength, mistook restraint for weakness, and underestimated the depth of your self-control. Ego resists admitting error, but silence offers no counterargument, no emotional reaction to deflect responsibility. The lack of response leaves her alone with her thoughts, and in that solitude, the truth begins to surface. This internal questioning creates cognitive tension. She must either adjust her narrative or continue believing a story that no longer matches reality. Slowly, reluctantly, her ego begins to soften. She starts to recognize that your behavior was never about seeking approval or validation. It was about discipline and choice. She realizes that your presence was a gift, not a guarantee. That recognition stings because it reframes the entire dynamic. It means she did not lose control because of circumstances. She lost it because she misunderstood the man she was dealing with. Her ego also begins to question its own role. She wonders whether pride prevented her from seeing your value clearly, whether assumptions blinded her to your intentions, and whether her need to feel secure in her own position caused her to dismiss your quiet strength. These reflections are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. They mark the point where illusion begins to dissolve and clarity takes its place. The story she once told herself was convenient, but convenience rarely survives truth. What pulls her thoughts back to you is not nostalgia, but recalibration. Her mind is trying to update its understanding of who you are. She recognizes that you are no longer someone she can define easily, and that realization restores a sense of mystery she did not anticipate. Mystery draws attention because it demands reassessment. The man she thought she understood now exists beyond the boundaries of her old narrative, and that shift forces her to think about you in a new, more honest way. In this moment, her ego faces a choice: cling to a story that no longer fits, or accept that she misjudged your strength. And acceptance, even when painful, brings clarity. And it is when her ego can no longer defend the old story that her thoughts return to you, not to rewrite the past, but to finally understand who you truly are. When scarcity awakens desire where familiarity once lived, the shift inside her mind is both subtle and inevitable. Familiarity is comfortable, predictable, and easy to overlook. When you are present, consistent, and available, your value blended into the background of her emotional world. Not because it wasn't significant, but because it felt stable. Stability, when unchallenged, often becomes invisible. She grew accustomed to your presence, your attention, your calm reliability, and in that comfort, appreciation slowly faded into assumption. But when you remove yourself, when your availability disappears, familiarity is replaced by absence and absent. CE introduces scarcity. Scarcity changes perception. What was once common suddenly feels rare. What was once predictable now feels uncertain. She begins to notice the space you left behind, not immediately as longing, but as disruption. Her routines feel slightly off. Emotional moments that once felt anchored now feel unsettled. The mind responds to scarcity by reassessing value, and it does so instinctively. She begins to think about you not because you demanded attention, but because your absence made her realize something essential is missing. Scarcity sharpens focus, and focus brings clarity. As time passes, her thoughts shift from casual recollection to deeper curiosity. She wonders why your absence feels heavier than she expected. She recalls moments she once dismissed: your patience, your emotional steadiness, your quiet presence, and begins to see them differently. What once felt ordinary now feels meaningful. The absence reframes the past, highlighting the consistency and reliability she took for granted. Scarcity does not create value, it reveals it. And in revealing it, her desire begins to awaken, not necessarily for reconciliation, but for understanding. This awakening challenges her emotional assumptions. She may have believed that excitement, novelty, or unpredictability defined attraction, but now, in the quiet space left by your absence, she begins to understand the deeper pull of stability and grounded presence. The calm you provided was not boring, it was secure, and security, once removed, is deeply missed. Scarcity forces her to confront the truth that comfort does not equal insignificance, and that what feels familiar often holds the greatest value. Your absence also introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty fuels imagination. She begins to wonder where you are, what you are doing, and who you are becoming. The lack of information draws her, though, back to you repeatedly. When something is no longer accessible, the mind assigns it greater importance. This is not manipulation, it is human psychology. Scarcity intensifies awareness, and awareness transforms perception. You are no longer part of her emotional environment. You are a question mark, and question marks demand attention. As her desire awakens, it is accompanied by reflection. She considers whether she fully appreciated what she had, whether familiarity dulled her awareness, and whether she misjudged the depth of your value. These thoughts are not driven by nostalgia alone, they are driven by recalibration. Scarcity forces reassessment. It compels the mind to reevaluate priorities, assumptions, and past decisions. And in that reevaluation, you reemerge not as a constant, but as a rare presence she no longer has easy access to. Over time, this shift settles into a quiet realization. She understands that desire often grows in the absence of certainty, and that what we assume will always be there is often what we value most once it is gone. Your absence did not create longing through pursuit or pressure, but through restraint. By stepping away, you allowed scarcity to do what familiarity could not, restore clarity. And it is through this absence that familiarity transforms into desire, pulling her thoughts back to you not because you returned, but because you chose not to. When the fear of permanent loss begins to surface in her mind, it triggers a profound internal reckoning. This fear does not appear suddenly or dramatically. It seeps in gradually, quietly at first, as a subtle awareness that what she once took for granted may no longer be available. She begins to notice the space you once filled, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and even psychologically. The absence is no longer a temporary gap. It becomes a looming presence in her. Consciousness, one that she cannot ignore. This is when her thoughts begin to return to you, not out of whim or curiosity, but out of the realization that something meaningful could be gone forever. The mind responds to loss instinctively. When she senses that your presence is not guaranteed, she begins to evaluate what you truly represented in her life. She recalls the steadiness, the calm, the reliability, and the quiet strength you provided. Memories she may have overlooked or dismissed come rushing back with new significance. She begins to recognize that your contributions to her emotional stability were unique and irreplaceable. The fear of permanent loss sharpens her perception, revealing the depth of value that was always present but never fully acknowledged. This awareness forces reflection on her past choices and behaviors. She begins to ask herself questions she may have avoided. Did I appreciate him enough? Did I take his presence for granted? Could I have acted differently to maintain what I had? The fear of losing you permanently breaks down the defenses her ego had built, and she is left confronting her own role in the dynamic. It is in this confrontation that regret begins to take root, not as an immediate desire to change the past, but as a recognition of what has been overlooked. Your absence also introduces a form of emotional gravity. When she senses that she may no longer have access to you, the emotional weight of the relationship shifts entirely onto her. She finds herself thinking about what she lost, replaying moments she previously undervalued, and imagining scenarios where things could have been different. This gravity is powerful because it is silent. There is no chasing, no pleading, no effort from your side. Her mind, in its attempt to process the permanence of loss, naturally gravitates back to you repeatedly. This is the paradox of absence. The less you are present, the more present you become in her thoughts. As her mind revisits your absence, clarity emerges. She begins to see the distinctions between superficial attraction and genuine value, between temporary attention and lasting presence. She realizes that your worth was never in drama, pursuit, or validation, but in the quiet, consistent, and disciplined way you carried yourself. The fear of losing that forever forces a level of appreciation she may not have experienced while you were readily available. It is not desperation that drives this reflection, but the acknowledgement of true significance. This process also reshapes her understanding of attachment and desire. She recognizes that permanence is not guaranteed, that opportunities are fleeting, and that what we value is often invisible until it is gone. Her thoughts return to you because permanence is no longer assumed, and scarcity combined with recognition of your value pulls her attention naturally. She realizes that the emotional equilibrium she once relied on is fragile, and that your absence has created a new perspective, one that illuminates what she may have failed to see. Eventually, her fear of permanent loss transforms into introspection, and in that introspection, she begins to reconsider priorities and assess the meaning of connection, strength, and presence. She understands that her focus on trivialities or distractions once prevented her from appreciating your significance. The permanence of absence crystallizes the lessons your silence and restraint have been teaching all along. Value is recognized not when it is easy, but when it is at risk of being lost. And it is in the weight of potential permanence that her mind returns to you, not because she can reclaim the past, but because the absence has made your presence unforgettable.